One of the difficulties of learning 3D is that you don't know what you don't know. And here's what I mean. Let's say that you've created a full scene in Blender and find yourself very disappointed with the result, because what you actually see on the computer screen is not at all what you envisioned in your mind. Now, you know what looks good, and that's why this particular render looks not quite right. However, the more you tinker, the less you seem to like the result. And this might be because what you're tinkering on is the stuff that you already know how to do, like maybe modeling or texturing, and the things that perhaps you struggled with, maybe that's composition or lighting, or maybe just the overall scene design. Those things go unchanged, and you keep getting a bad result every time you render. So if you're just starting out as a 3D artist and you understand this particular frustration, I want to give you some ideas for how to push those renders just a little bit further with only a few tweaks to your settings. Now, this render was shared in our Discord server by one of our students, and he agreed to let us use his project as an example. So let's see what we can do to heighten the aesthetic of this particular render. Before we even start taking a look at the lighting or at anything else in the scene, I want to take a look at the geometry. So let's switch to solid mode. And there are just a couple of things that we need to fix. First of all, these railings, you can see that they're still shaded flat. I don't mind this chamfer type edge, but let's change these to auto smooth. And that will smooth out all of the sides and just leave that chamfered edge. Now, you could make it a little more clean, but that's not the purpose of this video. Isn't to edit all of the geometry, but rather to try to take what we've got here and push it just a little bit further. So we're going to go ahead here and change that to shade smooth. Actually, maybe auto smooth. Yep. Auto smooth will work. Let's do the same thing on this other side. So let's now take a look at this pedestal. If we zoom in, you can see that it is also shaded flat. So I'm going to shade that to auto smooth, and that will smooth out this base and then give us that rippled look here in the middle. Now take a look at the bottom here. We can see that if I go to the side view, this actually isn't quite sitting on the floor. So I'm going to drag it right down here to the floor. And then I'm going to actually add just a little bit of a bevel down here, like a little chamfer bevel, just so that it gets a little bit of shadow in there and gives us a little bit of distance. So that looks pretty good. If I go too far down, it comes off. So I think we're good in terms of position. So when I back out to this rendered view, I am now able to see that the whole scene is very dark. Let me show you what would happen if I bring a light in here. I'm going to add a area light, grab it, let's move it up, let's change the size to something like 5 meters, and then let's bump the power up to 500. Oh yeah, that's too much, but let's go to 200. And you can see that already this scene is looking so much cleaner and crisper because there is more light in our scene. Now we can begin to add more lights, but there's actually a problem. I want to delete that light we've just created. We'll come back and make another one here in just a minute. But look at this scene when you zoom outside and see the actual superstructure. This HDRI is casting a bright light, and that light should be affecting this inner scene, but it just isn't. And the reason for that is because of the way that the glass shader was set up. So we're going to go into the shading window, and I'm going to adjust the shading setup to be what I want it to be, and then we're going to take a look at how this is working. So here's what he's built. He's got a glass BSDF and a transparent BSDF that is being mixed together, and the factor for that mix is the question, is it a camera ray? And this is actually the problem, because what we want to say is if it's a shadow ray, if the answer is yes, which means a value of 1 in computer speak. So yes equals 1, no equals 0, 1 is on, 0 is off. So if it is a shadow ray, we want the factor to be 1, because top is 0, bottom is 1. We want the factor to be 1, which means that the action on the shadow is going to be as though the whole thing was transparent. If it's not a shadow ray that's being cast through the light, so for instance like a light ray that's reflecting off of the glass, we want it to act as though the mix is a value of 0, which means that we're entirely glass. Now let's plug in the shadow ray instead of the camera ray, and immediately the scene has become a lot brighter. You can see now the light hitting these pillars here in the railing. So switch to camera ray, nothing. Switch to shadow ray, exactly what we want. And now if I zoom out, I'm going to switch to layout again, and then go back over here a little bit, go camera view, and now you can see we actually have that light spilling into the scene, which is fantastic. Now it's still not as bright as we want it to be, and you can see that it's taking its sweet time in rendering. So let's change something about that. Let's add a light. So I'm going to add an area light to get some light in my scene. I'm going to change the size. Let's bump it up to something like 5. The power to something like, oh man, let's go to what, 400? Oh, that might be too much. Let's go to 250, see where we are there. And then I'm going to change this beam spread from 180 and I'm going to crank it down so that it's not spreading out everywhere in the scene. I want this light to focus very specifically on the pumpkin. Then I'm actually going to change the size down to something like 3.5. And that way what we're doing here is focusing the attention of the viewer on the key subject in the scene. And so we want the light to be the brightest right on the key subject. So let's go ahead and keep playing with the light a little bit. So now we've got 250 watts of power hitting the light there. I'm actually going to move the color of this, push it just barely into the orange direction because we've got more of an orangish light coming from outside. And even though this isn't natural, like we're adding additional light to the scene, I want it to feel somewhat natural. And then let's take this and duplicate it. I'm going to duplicate it and move it this way, and we're going to light this side. I'm going to change the scale of this light to affect a different portion. So let's scale it on the Y, scale it on the X. I'm just going to push it back on the Y. Let's go see what that looks like in the camera view. Maybe push it into the Y direction. I'm just trying to light the whole scene up a bit. And I'm going to actually change the spread of this one back to 180, so it's just spreading across this whole section. Let's turn the power down to something like 150 maybe. By pushing this color of the light into a little more orange than we have on the center, what we are doing is creating a visual contrast where you've got a whiter and brighter light at the center and an orange and darker light on the outsides, which means our eye is naturally going to focus in on this centerpiece. That's what we want to have happening. Now that we've got this fill light over here, I'm just going to duplicate that light. I'm going to move it over here to the side, and without any real precision whatsoever, I'm just going to pop it here so that it's kind of filling in the same amount as this one is over here. One more thing I want to do with the lighting is that we've got these little sconces up here that he's added to the scene that give a really nice touch up there, but are doing nothing for us in terms of lighting. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to create a new texture, and we're going to call this one emissive light. Let's just call it emissive. And then we're going to go down here to the emission and change the value to something like 2.5. I don't know if that'll work. Let's see. Going to go to 0. Yep, that's casting nice light in the scene. And let's, again, we don't want it to be drawing too much attention, so we're going to kind of blend it into the orange color that's there in the background. So let's pop it into the orange direction, see if that works. I think that's probably okay. Yep, maybe even a little more. Bump it a little further. Then let's select this one, and then we're going to go to the material properties and make sure that we select that emissive. Where is the emissive? There it is. And so now we have these lights on the wall that just kind of add to the look of the scene. I'm liking that a lot. Let's change the way the camera looks at the pumpkin, because we want this camera to actually be focusing our attention on the pumpkin itself. So we've already worked to ensure that the lighting is focusing our attention here, but now what we want to do is make sure that the camera focuses our attention. And right now the camera is showing a lot of dead space up here on the top and off to the sides. So let's try to close that dead space a little bit and focus our viewer's eyes on the pumpkin. First thing I'm going to do is just drop the camera angle down a little bit. And then let's move it to the right. I'm going to bump it out here maybe. And then I'm going to adjust the angle in just a second, but let's change the focal length to something a little tighter, something like 35, or we could even go something like 40 perhaps. And let's just rotate it now. I'm going to hit R. I have the camera selected. I want to hit Z so that we rotate on the Z axis. And then I'm going to try to just center the camera there on the pumpkin and maybe even move it down a little bit more. And move it, now I'm rotating on the X to kind of pop it up so that we get a little bit of that skylight in there. And now the pumpkin kind of gets a more prominent role here in the scene. I'm even going to move the camera down further. I like it kind of looking up at the thing. And let's move it to this direction, more off-center. The reason I like, let's change to solid view so we can do this and see it a little more clearly. The reason I like this is that we've got it centered here, right? We've got a nice center in between the two railings. But we also have some off-centered, some kind of asynchronous and asymmetrical elements of the scene that just make it come alive a little bit. Let's change back to rendered view and see how this is working. I actually like this a lot now because the pumpkin is right in the center of the camera view. The light and the highlights of the light are really kicking the pumpkin into our attention. We've got this nice, interesting reflection coming from the light outside. The only thing I don't like is that we're not getting any of this skylight up here into the scene. And so I think I'm going to go back to the camera angle and change it to something like 35, and that gives us that view. That's perfect. One last thing with the camera before we move on is I'm going to add this depth of field. And I'm going to select the focus object where the camera is going to focus as this pumpkin body. And then we're going to make sure the f-stop is something pretty low. Right now it's at 2.8. I'm going to go to 1.8. And then that will just help focus the attention on the pumpkin even a little bit more by gently blurring out the background and the foreground and keeping our focus here on the pumpkin. Now this is looking great, but now we need to start talking about a couple of changes that need to be made to the textures. So first of all, what I want to do is change the scale of the tile here on the floor. And this is because when you are creating a scene like this, something that can break the illusion very quickly is the scale of your textures. Let's change to the material preview mode so that we can see this a little more clearly without that fuzziness of the mid-render. So when we zoom out here and we're looking at the size of the tile, let's imagine a human foot stepping on this stair. Okay, so that's maybe a foot and a few inches. That means that this tile here is almost 2 feet in length this way, and then maybe 3 or 4 feet the other direction, which is pretty big for marble tile. Now, it's possible that it could, be that big. That's totally fine, but I just want to change it a little bit. So I'm going to go to shading, and then I'm going to crank the size and scale down just a little bit. And in order to make it smaller, you have to scale the size of how many times it's repeated. So we're going to go to something like 7.5 just to add a little bit of size work on there. Now I'm going to go back to material preview mode, and we're going to take a look at the carpet because the carpet has very strong normals going on here. So we need to fix that and just dial it back. And when I look at this, you can see that actually what's happened is we have put the bump map in the wrong place. So what we need here is to take this bump and plug it into the normal instead, and then we're going to turn the strength of this down to something like 0.1. Now let's see what's happening. There we go. Now we don't have that really strong effect. You can still see the fibers, but it's not so pronounced that it's stealing the attention of the scene. Let's take a look at another thing that we could change. Over here with this wood texture, I'm going to select this one that I believe is the wood here, and I'm going to change this one. We're going to call it wood panel. And then we're going to change the scale of this as well, because again, if this is a foot, then that means this piece of wood is a foot and maybe more wide, which I just personally want to change the scale. So let's go to something like 3. Let's see how that looks. Now we can start to see the repeatability of the texture a little more, so I can maybe see why he would have done what he did. So let's just back it off to 2 and we'll leave it there. Here's another thing that I want us to do, because his brown color right here of this wood is kind of this reddish color, and it doesn't really work with the color of wood that we have down below. So we want to try to make those work together. 2 ways you could do this. One, you could actually just use this texture up here, but in our case, I'm just going to make it easy by using the eyedropper and selecting the same brown tint as we find down here, and then maybe bring up the value so that the value of the thing is closer to the color of the wood on this side. Let's make sure that that worked over here. It did. I'm going to actually pull the value down just a little bit so that it matches maybe a little better. Yep, I think that works. And then I want to do the same thing with the wood over here on these doors. In fact, what I might do is just grab this wood too and apply it there. Let's see what happens if we just apply it. Yep, that works. And it's going to be in the background, so we don't have to have it really clean. Let's leave it wood 2. Okay. All right, so now we've got these colors all matching, and I'm going to make sure that that value still just kind of dial it in to make sure it's right on target. I think that'll work. And so what that accomplishes is that it allows our scene to have a limited number of colors. So we've got this brown color that you see over here in the corner. You have the red of the stairs, you have the gold and the white. And so by limiting the color spectrum, how much color is showing up in the scene, and limiting them to these specific colors, then the whole scene feels more cohesive and unified, and you don't have to really work as hard to get those colors to work together. So let's switch to rendered mode and just kind of see how this is looking, eyeballing it here in the scene. And you can see that we've got a big problem them here with our stairs somewhere. Something about switching to the cycles renderer has killed it. Let's take a look. Actually, what killed it is the fact that we have the Voronoi texture here in the wrong spot. Since it is not a normal map, it should not be plugged into the normal. It should be plugged into the height, and there we go. Now that's looking fine. And this looks pretty good. I'm really satisfied with how this is turning out. One more thing, though, that we need to do to kind of limit the color palette is to switch this turquoise color that's up here in these pillars and these kind of like banner-looking things. Change this turquoise to something else. In fact, I'm just going to remove it and let whatever takes its place take its place. And actually, we can't just remove it because it's everywhere, and I don't want to have to do that for everything. So let's actually just take this one. I'm going to pull the saturation off so that it's white too, and that should have fixed it everywhere. Yep, that looks good. So then we go back to our view. We don't have that turquoise color showing up. Everything is looking pretty good. Let's talk for just a moment about rendering. When I first rendered this for the initial preview, the render setting was at 4,096 samples, which is a lot. Now, it does make a little bit of a difference in the in terms of the detail that you're able to see when the render is finished, but the difference is so minimal that it's actually better to dial it back to something like 200. So I'm going to dial it back to 200. I'm also going to go down here to my render settings of color management. Right now it's on the view transform of AGX, which is the best that you can get from Blender right now. And then I want to change to a medium high contrast, and you can see it just made it a little more sharp in terms of the contrast, and that's how I like it. So I'm going to leave it there. And then you could adjust the exposure up or down to your preference as well. I'm going to leave it at the default mode where we have it currently. And then let's go back to the layout view. I'm going to go back to my camera, change to rendered, and let's see what this looks like when we actually put it to the renderer. There we go, and I'm really happy with how this is turning out so far. One thing I do notice as I look at the scene, though, is that up here in this big skylight, we actually have some reflections of the HDRI showing up and reflections of the carpet down here that are showing up that are a little too strong in drawing attention in that direction. And so what I actually want to do is fix that by just, we don't even need the glass on there. I'm going to just pull it up in the air, and then you can see those are gone. I'm actually going to, now that we have that, I'm going to hit rotate on the X and actually angle it up just a little bit more, and maybe even move the camera in just a touch. I'm going to focus on the camera, GZZ to kind of move forward, and just kind of push the focus a little more toward the pumpkin, because this line down here that you can see in the texture is a little bit distracting in the render. So I'm going to pull it back. Let's hit a render again and see how this one looks. So this is looking much better. I only want to do 2 changes to this at this point. First, I want to move these lights here further up closer to the ceiling because I don't like the shadow that it's casting right there. So I want them to be a little bit further up and perhaps even a little lower in terms of power. And then the other thing I want to do is add some compositing effects. So let's select these 2 lights. I'm just going to grab those and move them up until we're just below the ceiling. That way it's coming to that edge. I'm going to move them a little bit along the Y so that then there's a little bit more dispersion there. And I don't even think I have to lower the power now because of where they are. I think that'll work just fine. And then let's go to the compositing tab. Now in the compositing tab, I can select this option that says use nodes. And then I'm going to grab this output of the composite, and I'm going to add what is called a dispersion or a distortion node for lens distortion. So there we go. I'm going to search here for lens distortion. I'm going to drop that right down here. Now, if I want to be able to see what effect this is having, I can Control-Shift left click on this particular node if I have Node Wrangler enabled, and now I will see a nice preview hovering behind my node setup. Now, what I'm going to do is add some lens dispersion that just kind of changes the color and the distortion here on the edges of the lenses. So I'm going to hit 0.01, and you can see if I mute this and unmute it, you'll see the effect it's having here on the corner. So I'm going to unmute it and then mute it, unmute it. And you can see it's just a little bit of distortion, but it really serves to keep our eyes from focusing on what's at the sides of the scene and keep our eye here in the center. And overall, the experience of the image is more like we see from a regular camera lens. So this really is kind of a secret sauce for helping sell the believability of a digital image render. And it's a very easy addition that you can do with any render. It doesn't take a complicated compositing setup in order to do. You can just add these couple of nodes and you're set to go. So now let's move to the layout and take one final look at our image. I'm going to select my camera and I'm going to go over here to the viewport display. I'm going to turn on the center composition guide and crank this, I don't know how to say that, passepartout. I think it's French, so it'd probably not sound anything like what I just said. But if you change that up to 1, then you'll black out everything that is not part of the camera view. And from looking at it this way, I can see we're centered. However, the image looks a little catty-cornered, almost because the railings here aren't quite centered. And so I'm just going to kind of play with this just a little bit. I'm going to let the pumpkin be not quite centered here. Let's grab it and pull it down, maybe even, so that then it's centered on the frame. And I'm just going to choose a composition that I think looks pleasing. And so now let's go ahead and render this out. I hope this has been a help to you. If you need help elevating your renders, then you really should join our Discord server where a thriving community of 3D nerds are working together to grow as artists. The link to that server is in the description, and I really hope to see you there.